All right, we'll go ahead and get started now. So, hi everyone, thank you for joining us this evening on this cold, snowy, bleak evening. I think it's appropriate for tonight's topic. My name is Jessica Pierce. You're probably not used to seeing my face. I'm usually behind the scenes. Pete's usually front and center, but I'm the film series general clerk, which doesn't really apply to me right now since we don't really have a box office. But I am, as Pete likes to call me, the second in command, which means I help with a lot of things, marketing, I do some copy, but tonight that means being the temporary host. So if you're new here, we are the Webster Film Series, St. Louis's only year-round nonprofit cinema. Normally we are screening films in the Winifred Moore Auditorium on Webster University's campus, but of course, due to the pandemic, our doors have been closed and we can't reopen just yet. However, we've been screening films in our virtual theater pretty consistently since last March, so please stay on top of that if you're interested in supporting us. We will reopen our doors eventually, but in the meantime, in an effort to stay engaged with the community and keep conversations going, Pete had the wonderful idea to start our own speaker series. So what that is every Thursday night at 7 p.m., we have a different speaker talking, and it's virtual and it's free to the public. And we're going to be doing this continually until we can finally reopen our doors, whenever that is. So each month we're focusing on a different director, and each week within that month, we're focusing on a different speaker, be they a film critic, a professor, or a cinephile, speaking on a different film from said director. So this month, of course, the focus is Rainer Werner Fassbinder. And this week, tonight, we have Pete Timmermann, director of the film series, speaking on In a Year with 13 Moons. Next Thursday, we have Robert Hunt, in his own words, recovering film critic, speaking on The Third Generation. And then next month, we'll switch gears to Sofia Coppola. I'll be speaking next month on one of her films, but more details on that will be coming at a later date. So please keep up with that and all of our events we have coming up. We also work with the Confucius Institute pretty often. So if you do want to keep up with us, we are on Facebook at Webster Film Series. That's our handle. And we're also on Instagram and Twitter at WU Film Series. You can also message me directly tonight if you're interested in getting on our mailing list. It's just me sending out weekly emails at most. They're not super frequent, but just whenever we have updates. But yeah, if you'd like to get on that, you can message me, preferably directly, so we're not clogging up the chat, and make sure to do it when I'm not talking so I don't get distracted. But as far as updates go, we have a few films in our virtual theater that I want to mention before we get started. So tonight is the last night to rent the film Softy, which is a documentary about Boniface Mwangi, a Kenyan photojournalist turned politician. You can rent it tonight still, even though tonight's the last night, and you will get it for an entire week to watch. So you still have time if you get it tonight. We have one more week for Atlantis in our virtual theater. Atlantis is the new Ukrainian dystopian film about war and PTSD and grappling with loneliness in the near future. You can get that one for a 3-day period. And then on February 26th, we have Un Film Dramatique, which is a new French documentary about a middle school. It focuses on some middle schoolers who, in large part, are telling the story themselves with their own cameras, and they kind of drive the narrative. And it's pretty cool to watch their kind of evolution of growth over the years. So I recommend all of those, of course, but if you do rent any of them, you will be supporting us. We get half of the proceeds on any films that you rent from us. So that's another way to support us. So for tonight, we have our Q&A box open, and please feel free to drop any questions that you have at any point in the presentation, and we'll do the Q&A toward the end. You can also raise your hand. There should be a little hand emoji for you to raise your hand if you want toward the end as well, if you'd rather speak your question. So you raise your hand and then I'll unmute you and then you can ask your question that way. But I think that's everything. So without further ado, Pete Timmermann.
Hey, thank you. Let me share my screen. I made a PowerPoint for you. Does that work for everybody? Wait, I can't see anybody. I will assume that works for everybody until I hear otherwise.
It works.
It's okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk about In a Year with 13 Moons. So I became a big fan of Fassbinder's somewhere around 2003. I had been aware of him, but I wasn't successful in seeing any of his films in 2003. But then at that point, the floodgates opened. So in the year of 2003, I watched a whole lot of Fassbinder films. And we've talked a lot in past weeks about how he made over 40 movies in a period of about 14 years, 13 years, something like that. But yeah, I didn't watch all of them. To this day, I haven't seen all of them, but I've seen maybe 25 or so, and most of them came all in a big glut. And at that time, I had trouble figuring out if In a Year with 13 Moons or if Ali Fear's The Soul was his best film. And I've still never decided. 20 years later, I'm still a big fan. I've filled in some of the gaps of movies that I haven't seen. Between the two, I've seen Fear's The Soul much more. I've probably seen Ali Fear's The Soul something like 50 times, where In a Year with 13 Moons, including the research I did for this speaking engagement tonight, I've seen maybe 5. I've seen it like a fraction of the times I've seen Fear's The Soul. If you've seen both of those movies, though, it's probably obvious why. Fear's The Soul, for the most part, is an enjoyable film. In the Year with 13 Moons is not. I think it's a fantastic film. Objectively, I think it's the better film between the two of them. But it's a rough watch. You'd think I would know better at this point. I've taught Fassbinder a lot of times. I've taught this specific film on one occasion even. But yeah, just the other night I watched it. This was, I don't know, Sunday or Monday or something. But I watched it early in the evening and it just ruined my night to where the rest of the night I was just moping around. So I don't know. For those of you that watched it to prepare for this event, I'm grateful. I'm grateful to you. So that leads me to my first slide, that I am sorry in general that I put you through this. I'm also sorry about a lot of other things. A big one here is that I'm not trans. When a bunch of our speakers, like potential speakers and friends of the film series and stuff, were discussing the possibility of doing the speakers series, when we decided we were going to do Fassbinder first, I kind of jumped on In a Year with 13 Moons. It was the one that I wanted to do. But once it was locked in and like the wheels were turning to where like this was going to become the one that I was going to present, almost immediately I was like, oh, I've made a huge mistake. I'm not trans. I'm no authority on trans culture. I don't know. I know nothing. I just know nothing in general. I will do my best to not speak out of turn, but if I do, I would hope that you won't like log off in anger and instead point out how I was wrong when we get to the Q&A. I would certainly welcome that if worse comes to worse. Also, in the meantime, Jessica, if I say something stupid, maybe like unmute your camera and look really disappointed in me and then mute it again. That would be very helpful. But then also in addition to, I don't know, not being any kind of authority whatsoever on trans culture, I don't speak German at all. My heritage is almost 100% German, both my mom's side and my dad's side. But yeah, I've never studied German. I don't know a whole lot about German culture. So that means you're probably going to be in for the butchering of a whole lot of German names and words and things like that. So I apologize for that too. So I wanted to start the discussion, or I guess the talk, the presentation, with how Fassbinder got to the point where he made a movie like In a Year with 13 Moons. I don't think it's that far afield from most of the stuff that he made, but it is maybe more extreme in its like despondency. Just, I don't know, its overall level of depression. So when I've taught Fassbinder in the classroom, I like to say to my students that he has about the most interesting Wikipedia page that you can ever hope to read. Maybe Beatrice Dahl could give him some competition on that front. But there's something strange about reading, like whether it's his Wikipedia page or a biography or something, it's almost like reading a true crime novel or something like that. I feel like a lot of times when I talk about it, it almost seems like I think it's funny, and I certainly don't think it's funny. So if I give you that impression, I apologize. But his life is very tragic in a way that he depicts in his films. So if you watch his films, you get pretty used to people dying at the end. You get pretty used to people committing suicide, but that very much was his life. Last week, for example, when Kate Lohr was discussing The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant, it came up when she was presenting that his first female lead, it's the female lead in his second short film, The Little Chaos, which he made when he was 21 years old. Her husband thought that she had taken too much of an infatuation to Fassbinder, and he stabbed her 7 times. She survived, but she was paralyzed for the rest of her life. But his biography is littered with stuff like that. Like so many of his friends and acquaintances committed suicide or were killed in strange ways, and then Fassbinder himself died at a very young age. But you get this in interviews with them. His interviews are both very interesting in that way that I just described, like on a borderline true crime level. But then he's also very intelligent. So I don't know, like academic true crime, if there were such a thing. But there was one interview that stuck out to me. This was undated. It's in the book Anarchy of the Imagination. But he was interviewed by school children, and it begs the question: who would ever let school children anywhere near Fassbinder, who was a decidedly problematic character? But we'll come back to that. But so among the questions school children asked him is they asked how he expected to experience old age, and his answer was, I don't expect to experience it. They asked him if he thought that suicide could be justified on principle, and he answered, yes, I think it can be justified on principle. The school children asked him, do you look forward to the future or do you approach it with pessimism? And he said that that's not an issue for me. He's not going to experience the future. But yeah, so there is just this kind of, I don't know, thick strain of dread woven throughout his life, but also kind of like a suicidal ideation, or like the conception of death as being like the one true liberation. So that's kind of a constant theme in most of his films, if not all of them. Of course, the two that we've focused on already this month, Fear Eats the Soul and Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant, are unusual in that nobody dies in the end, but they are very unusual. So if you've only seen these three Fassbinder films that we've done in the series, you haven't entirely seen it. In most of his other films, they do end almost always with death and usually by suicide. So in that way, like I said, In a Year with 13 Months isn't that far afield from the other things that he's done. But specifically to In a Year with 13 Moons, we need to look at his love life, like his personal life. So his biographer, Robert Katz, who wrote the book Love is Colder Than Death, it was the first biography of Fassbinder after he died, he identified that there were three great loves in Fassbinder's life. So the first one is Gunther Kaufmann. You probably recognize Gunther Kaufmann. He is an actor in A Year with 13 Moons. He's Anton Seitz's chauffeur, but he was the first of Fassbinder's great loves. So Gunther Kaufmann, he was with Fassbinder for most of Fassbinder's career as a director. He's in 14 of his feature films, beginning with Gods of the Plague in 1970 up until Carell in 1982. Carell is his final film. So he was in maybe 1/3 or so of Fassbinder's total feature films, but there was throughout his career, most of his other actors, and a lot of times people behind the scenes too, would only work with him for a few years and then disappear. But yeah, Gunther was kind of always there. Gunther was the son of a Black American GI and a German woman who conceived him during World War II. But yeah, he's, I don't know, he's one of those characters, once you get an eye for him and understand how he fits into Fassbinder's life, he's kind of a reassuring presence. There aren't a whole lot of those in Fassbinder's films, but it's nice to see old Gunther pop up. His second great love is El Hadi Ben Salem, who we saw, of course, in Fear Eats the Soul. So El Hadi Ben Salem is Moroccan. Fassbinder met him in Paris, in a bathhouse in Paris, and took him back to Germany with him. So he's in 8 Fassbinder films, most notably Fear Eats the Soul, where he's the lead. And because of Fear Eats the Soul, he's my favorite of the great loves. I really like El Hadi Ben Salem a lot. So yeah, he's an actor in 8 of Fassbinder's films, starting with The Merchant, 4 Seasons, and ending with Fox and His Friends. He also was the prop master on Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant last week, but he's not on screen in that one because no men are on screen in that one. But El Hadi Ben Salem, as came up week before last, he went to prison for attempted murder, and he committed suicide in prison in 1977. So In a Year with 13 Moons in 1978. So his Fassbinder's second great love committed suicide the year prior. His third great love is Armin Meier. So Armin Meier is also in 8 Fassbinder films, like El Hadi Ben Salem was. The first one was Mother Küsters Goes to Heaven in 1975, and the last one is Germany in Autumn in 1978. We'll talk about Germany in Autumn here in a minute. But he lived with Fassbinder for about 3.5 years, give or take. It was probably a little more than that, closer to 4. But Fassbinder was prone to talking about Armin Meier in interviews. In one interview that I read from 1977, Fassbinder spoke to the interviewer and named Armin by name. He said that he'd lived with Armin Meier for 3.5 years, and that it was a particularly difficult relationship. But you would see these kind of references to the relationship being problematic peppered throughout some interviews that Fassbinder was doing at the time that he and Armin were together. So I guess now is as good a time as any to introduce like kind of a conception of duality to Fassbinder. This is something that comes up in a lot of Fassbinder studies, was that he was someone, he tended to encompass both poles on a lot of issues. So like you see a lot of references among his friends and collaborators that he was very brutal and very cruel and like treated people terribly, but at the same time was very loving and very tender and like would give you all the attention of the world. He just kind of oscillate between those two extremes. Or like he was an authoritarian that like he wanted everything done exactly his way, and like he was, you know, the one and only boss in the film set. And he was basically like a brutal dictator, but he believed in like communal utopian living, and like most of his collaborators, both in front of and behind the camera, live with them. Like they would live in a commune, basically. Um, but so I guess with that in mind, like his tendency both toward the tender and the cruel, you can imagine what it was like to be one of Fassbinder's lovers. But Armin Meier was kind of on the outs with Fassbinder in early 1978, and Fassbinder was treating him cruelly. So the Fassbinder film Germany in Autumn had its big like gala premiere in early 1978, and Fassbinder didn't invite him. I'll talk about Germany in Autumn next. But so Armin Meier was Fassbinder's boyfriend at the time, and also he was one of the actors in Germany in Autumn, but Fassbinder wouldn't let him come to the premiere. And then just after that, Fassbinder had his 33rd birthday, and he tended to have these big birthday bashes. It were these big kind of like social events, both for the Fassbinder like core group, but also for the larger world. But right after that, Fassbinder didn't allow for Armin Meier to go to his birthday party either. So just after Fassbinder's birthday party, the one that he hadn't allowed Armin Meier to attend, Armin Meier killed himself in Fassbinder's apartment, which that's bad enough. His second, I mean, like obviously that's bad enough. That's an understatement to say it that way. And that's sort of what I was talking about. I feel like you can't talk about Fassbinder. There's so much gravity involved. It's hard not to sound like flippant or like you're gossiping. I don't know. It's kind of a minefield to navigate. But so, as if it weren't already bad enough that Armin Meier killed himself, but also Fassbinder's second grade love had killed himself the year before. So that's 2 of 3 suicides in just about a year's period. But Meier killed himself in Fassbinder's apartment, and Fassbinder didn't go back to his apartment for a while. And how he came to be found was neighbors complained about the smell, and Fassbinder's mom found him. And it's not entirely known when exactly he killed himself, but it's something like a week before he was found. So his exact date of death isn't known. So I was saying that if you read interviews with Fassbinder circa like 76 or 77, a lot of times he would say that his relationship with Armin Meier was somewhat problematic. Like he would say, I don't know, like there would be hints that like neither one was very happy. But then after Armin killed himself, there's one particularly, I don't know, touching / upsetting interview that Fassbinder gave, where he said that Fassbinder, was unable to provide the minimum amount of happiness needed to survive, which I feel like that's kind of In a Year with 13 Moons in brief. Like someone that could say something that sad is the only type of person that could make a movie like In a Year with 13 Moons. So I promised you that we'd talk about Germany in Autumn. I apologize for the bad, like the low quality image there. Germany in Autumn is not a difficult movie to see necessarily. It's sorry. Facets has the rights in the United States to it. Like the St. Louis Public Library has a copy. I've got like a DVD copy. Like it's not like it's buried or anything, but it doesn't exist in very good quality. So like that's about the best looking image I've ever seen of it. Look at Fassbinder's fat old belly. It's, I don't know. And that's of course Armin behind him there. But so Germany in Autumn, I've been referring to as a Fassbinder film. Fassbinder it's one of those compilation films that were so popular in Western Europe in the 60s and 70s. He is one of 11 directors of that film. So 11 different directors made short films into this one compilation film. But that said, Germany in Autumn is 1 hour and 59 minutes, and the Fassbinder film is 30 minutes. So there are 11 shorts. You would think they would all be like 10 or 11 minutes apiece, but no, Fassbinder kind of took over. So 1/4 of that film is a Fassbinder film. But so Fassbinder's short in Germany in Autumn, almost all of it is set in Fassbinder's apartment, and it's him and Armin Meier and then Fassbinder's mom, Lilo Pomheit, who is an actress in his films. Also, we'll talk about his mom here in a minute, and she's come up in previous weeks as well. And it's sort of this weird like fiction documentary hybrid, to where like it seems like you're watching a documentary, and on some level you are, like they're playing themselves. It's not scripted or anything like that. But that said, it is, I don't know, blocked. Like it's sort of a heightened reality. But so the Germany in Autumn, the whole compilation film, not just Fassbinder's section, takes off from the point of the terrorist attacks in Germany in 1977, including like the Baader-Meinhof group, if you're familiar with them. But there were hijacked airplanes and like department stores set on fire, like hostages taken, stuff like that. But Germany in Autumn is basically a reaction to that. So in Germany in Autumn, there's kind of an easy familiarity between Fassbinder and Meier, which I guess you could assume of people who had been dating and living together for 3 or 4 years at that point. For a good chunk of the half an hour, like 10 minutes of the half an hour, they're both nude and very like comfortable with each other nude. Which, like I said, it's not surprising given their relationship. You don't really see that in scripted movies. Even like if you had two people, like I don't know, this isn't the best example maybe, but like Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman in Eyes Wide Shut, they still feel like actors. I feel like Fassbinder and Meier don't feel like actors in Germany in Autumn, which is, like I said, it's that documentary fiction film hybrid. If anything is known about Germany in Autumn at this point, it's largely that there's a scene in it where Fassbinder is talking on the phone about the suicide of some of the terrorists in prison. It's kind of a controversial topic in that 3 of the accused terrorists, or I don't know, guilty terrorists, I guess, they committed suicide in prison with a gun, but it was never explained how they could have gotten a gun into one of the highest security prisons like in the world. It was kind of like a Jeffrey Epstein thing where people didn't trust the outcomes. Like, oh, the officials told us to kill themselves, but like, how did they, like, if you were a terrorist in jail with a gun, would you kill yourself? You would probably do something else with the gun. But so Fassbinder is discussing those purported suicides on the phone, and while he's talking about them on the phone, he's speaking in kind of a heightened state, and he's nude. And he kind of, I apologize for being crass, but he's something close to masturbates. He like it's maybe like a step down from masturbation. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. I mean, you can imagine. But so this is the film that Armin Meier wasn't allowed to come to the premiere of. And here he's one of 3 actors in a very familiar setting, shot in Fassbinder's apartment. The other major actor is Fassbinder's mom. It is deliberately exclusionary of Fassbinder to not let Meier go into something like this. Fassbinder's treatment of Meier and of many others is awful. There's a thing that I've struggled with as a fan of Fassbinder's. Like, I love his films, and I would rank Fassbinder among my favorite directors, like top 10 favorite directors, period. I tend to be drawn to artists that have sensibilities that are ahead of their time, to where like they were making movies in some past period, they're of a previous generation, but their films have their sensibilities are in line with where our sensibilities are now. So I think of like the experimental filmmaker Maya Deren, or the poet Frank O'Hara, or people like that. I think Fassbinder is one of those. But the trick with Fassbinder was that he was also terrible. If he were making films right now, he would be canceled, and probably rightfully so. And I think to take it a little further, I feel like if Germany in Autumn was made and released, and then like Armin Meier killed himself, but it was happening now and not in the late 70s, Germany in Autumn would probably be quashed. Like, I think it would be one of those situations where it would be deemed like very like deeply disrespectful to allow people to see this movie that on some level led to Armin Meier's suicide. I've been saying that like I've made a fuss about how it's just Fassbinder and Meier and his mom in Fassbinder's apartment. For the most part, they're arguing. Like, it's not a particularly congenial film. And Fassbinder is very mean to both Meier and his mom. But anyway, so that is what leads us to In a Year with 13 Moons. So it's Fassbinder's response, like it's kind of emotional working through the suicide of Meier, which left him devastated. From what I've been able to tell, I mean, like for as many people as met bad ends in Fassbinder's life, it was Meier's suicide that affected him the most deeply. It really left him reeling. No movie pun intended. But so In a Year with 13 Moons is generally considered Fassbinder's most personal film, and that is quite a that's no small statement, because all of Fassbinder's films are pretty personal. One of the things that people point to when they argue that this is the most personal film is that Fassbinder really, really took over on this one. So again, it's come up in previous weeks if you've attended the previous events, how prolific Fassbinder was. He made over 40 feature films over a period of 13 years. He averaged about one full completed feature film every 100 days for 13 years. Can you imagine? Like, that is absolutely ridiculous. But that's just, I mean, we're talking about, I don't know, there's an implication he's like directing, he's doing everything, basically. He's directing them, he's writing them, he often stars in them. If he doesn't star in them, he's a supporting player. He's also like writing and directing, sometimes acting in plays on the side. He's acting in other directors' films. There's a lot going on. I don't know. He works, I guess, at an unprecedented pace. But so in A Year with 13 Moons, he does more than usual. So it's not just that he directed it, it's not just that he wrote it, but this one he also produced it. The money actually all came from Fassbinder too. It didn't come from any public funding. Fassbinder was a pretty good fundraiser, and I think in large part because he worked quickly and reliably and cheaply, and he had an international name. So it tended not to be hard for him to get money together, especially in this period, like by the late 70s. But yeah, Fassbinder, he put up his own money to make A Year with 13 Moons. So we've got writer, we've got director, we've got producer. He was also the production designer on this one. He was also the cinematographer on this one, which is pretty unusual. He worked with great cinematographers. We've talked a lot about Michael Ballhaus and Jürgen Jürgens in past weeks, but here Fassbinder shot this one himself. And he also was probably the editor of this film. So he's doing basically everything. Really, I think the one key role that he didn't do, aside from acting, he doesn't really act in this film, is he didn't write the score. He always worked with Pierre Rabin. And yeah, Rabin wrote the score for A Year with 13 Moons too, but pretty much everything else that Fassbinder could do, he did do. So to give you an example of timeline, I was just saying that Fassbinder made a complete feature film every 100 days over a period of 13 years. So Armin Meier killed himself, it was either late May or early June of 1978. And like I said, his exact date of death isn't known because it took a little while for his body to be found. But then Fassbinder wrote the script for A Year with 13 Moons over the course of just 3 or 4 days and was shooting it by July. And it was in theaters by November. So about 6 months after Meier killed himself, maybe less, 5 months, this movie was in theaters and was a response / kind of like working through of his death on Fassbinder's part. So in 1981, a year before Fassbinder's death, he wrote a list of his own best films, like he ranked his own best films, and he said that this was the second best film he ever made. He said that his first best was Beware of a Holy Horror, which we'll talk about briefly a little while from now. That's not one that we're doing in the Fassbinder February series. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's sort of charming in a weird way that he says this is his second best film. It's your best film, Fassbinder. If not this, Fear It's This All. And then also that same year, he made a list of the quote unquote most important films or most important German films. But yeah, he said that this was one of the 14 most important German films ever made. I don't entirely disagree with this. Again, if it sounds like I'm making fun of him, I don't really mean to. In fact, I think if anything, he's underestimating himself. So you got used to Volker Spengler as Elvira Weishaupt, the lead in A Year with 13 Moons. Volker is Fassbinder's one most key collaborator on this film, aside from Pierre Rabin, and more so than Pierre Rabin. I think I brought up Rabin before because he did the one job behind the camera that Fassbinder didn't do, basically. But Spengler was the only person who had much like artistic collaboration on A Year with 13 Moons specifically. He came from stage acting, and he went back to stage acting too. He worked in film off and on for the rest of his career, but Fassbinder mostly found him on the stage and put him in films, and then he had a pretty successful career in both places after that. He worked with Fassbinder quite a bit. So I've kind of alluded to it already, and it's come up in past sessions that Fassbinder lived like commune style with the people that he worked with. But Spengler did live as part of the Fassbinder sex cult for a while. And Spengler and Meier worked with each other. So here Spengler is playing like some kind of variation on Armin Meier. Armin Meier wasn't trans. I don't mean to mislead you on that front. But still, Elvira is based fairly loosely on Armin Meier. And it wasn't that Spengler didn't know who this person was. Like Spengler, lived with them along with Fassbinder and some others. Spengler worked with him on 5 different films. They're both in, 4 different films. Both of them are in The Station Master's Wife, Despair, Chinese Roulette, and Satan's Brew. But so, assuming that you watched the movie A Year with 13 Moons, you know that over the final sequence, there's an audio played. It's like kind of an extended monologue of Elvira's explaining, among other things, like past suicide attempts, as you're seeing that Elvira had committed suicide. So like the image on the screen is that you see Elvira has died, while on the audio track, you hear Elvira talking about like her bad upbringing and how she's attempted suicide, etc. But that was all actually improvised by Spengler, that whole speech. The story goes that on the last day of shooting, Fassbinder cornered Spengler and had him improvise that speech in character, but a whole lot of that wound up in the film. And that's not really Fassbinder's style. He wrote most of his films, and the films that he didn't write, I think, are among his worst. Just a couple of films prior to In a Year with 13 Moons, he made Despair with Dirk Bogarde. Despair is his first English language film. It's based on the Vladimir Nabokov novel. I'm an idiot, I'm sorry. It's based on a Vladimir Nabokov novel, and the screenplay was written by Tom Stoppard, the great playwright, among other things, and screenwriter. He wrote, Despair doesn't work. Like it's kind of one of the rare, not so great Fassbinder films, and I think it's because Fassbinder didn't write the script. So for Fassbinder to allow just like his lead actor to write such a long monologue and then include so much of it in the film, and it's so affecting in the film too, it really works. But I think a lot of how it came to pass that Spengler got this role of Elvira, and how he became such a key collaborator on this project, is that when Fassbinder learned of Meyer's death and subsequently spiraled out because of it, Fassbinder was a relatively public person, but he went and hid. And the place that he chose to hide was a room in Spengler's flat. But he hid there apparently for days in a single room without coming out. So Spengler was kind of like that one good friend that helps you get through the trauma, you know. So I wanted to talk about this film as biography of Armin Meier. It's not really. I don't mean to imply that it is. I've already said that Armin Meier wasn't trans, among other things, but there are some biographical elements. So a lot of it comes, the scene where Elvira and Red Zora, his friendly prostitute that is maybe less friendly by the end, they go and see where Elvira grew up, and they speak to Sister Gudrun. Sister Gudrun is played by Fassbinder's mom. So again, it goes back to that thing I was saying, like Volker Spengler knew Armin Meier, like this tragic death where he's kind of playing that character was, like a friend of Spengler's. But here, Fassbinder's mom was one of the other people in Germany in autumn. She, of course, knew Armin Meier. She was the one that found Armin Meier's body, and she's playing the nun that raised Elvira in this film. But a lot of what she says about his childhood was based on Armin Meier's childhood. So Armin Meier was actually raised by nuns. He was sexually abused as a kid, not by the nuns, at least not so far as I know. But the point is he had a very, very rough childhood. And then when he eventually broke through and kind of started to become his own person as an adult, the first place that he got a job was as a butcher at a slaughterhouse, which of course, that comes into play here in a minute. But when he worked as a butcher, and then he was in a bar, and Fassbinder kind of came in and swooped him up and took him under his wing. Not entirely unlike Anton Seitz in this film, but it's strange. Fassbinder did have a tendency to do like autobiographical elements in his films. Like a lot of his films, it's pretty easy to read. Like this person's a stand-in for Fassbinder, and this person's a stand-in for someone else. We were talking about that last week with The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant. But yeah, the best reading of In a Year with 13 Moons implies that Elvira is Armin Meier and Anton Seitz, the villain, is Fassbinder. I also think it's noteworthy too that in 1975, Fassbinder made Fox and His Friends, which we don't have in our Fassbinder February series, but it's one of his best films. I like Fox and His Friends a lot. But Fox and His Friends is dedicated to Armin Meier. So this is years before Armin, like it's toward the beginning of their relationship. It's years before Armin Meier commits suicide or anything. I don't mean to spoil it, but like I said, if you've seen much in the way of Fassbinder films, you'll know what to expect anyway. Fox and His Friends is about sort of like a poor, uncultured gay man who's taken under the wing of like a more sociable, I don't know, like from a societal standpoint, upstanding gay man. But then the upstanding gay man dumps the less intelligent and socialized gay man at the end, and the less intelligent one kills himself. But yeah, so Fassbinder dedicated that film to Armin and all the others, and then 3 years later, that basically happened. Like that exact thing happened. So yeah, I was just assuming that you wanted to talk about the slaughterhouse scene. I've said a few times that I've taught Fassbinder in classrooms a lot. I always teach Fear Eats the Soul. I've taught Fear Eats the Soul 25, 30 times. I've taught In a Year with 13 Moons once. But my experience of showing In a Year with 13 Moons to other people is that, of course, they want to talk about the slaughterhouse scene. Of course, they want to talk about the slaughterhouse scene. It's hard to know where to start with it, though. One of Fassbinder's many biographers is, a lot of his biographers are Fassbinder's friends. I think it bears mentioning, like people that knew him personally. But one of them is Christian Brad Thompson. But Christian Brad Thompson writes fairly beautifully about In a Year with 13 Moons, where he says, among other things, that like the image track is too much to bear. Like it's very, very difficult to watch what's going on in that scene. But then the audio track is also very difficult to bear, where like you're hearing about the traumas in Elvira's life, to where like you kind of switch from one to the other, like you ping pong between them, to where like you kind of focus on the images until that becomes too much, and then you focus on the audio until that becomes too much. But like they don't complement each other, and that's by design, where just the whole thing is too much. To where it leaves you very rattled, and you don't really get a whole lot of either side. Like both the audio track and the visual track deserve more attention than what you're probably giving them. Which I think is a pretty good way to put it. Also, I just love, I don't know, love is a weird word to use in this case, but the shrieking, like Volker Spengler's delivery of those lines. Fassbinder tends to get a lot of credit from his fans, that he's very good with like the musicality of dialogue, and that's one of the reasons why his German language films are so much better than his 3 English language films, and stuff like that. But there's such like an operatic quality to like how, I don't know, even if the subtitles weren't on and he didn't speak German, you would know pretty much what Volker Spengler was saying as of Elvira in the audio track over the slaughterhouse scene. But yeah, even, I don't know, like I said, I'm a avowed fan of this movie. I've counted it among my favorites for the past almost 20 years, but I have trouble telling you a whole lot of what goes on in that scene for the reason that Thompson describes, where it's too hard to pay attention to in a weird way. Like it's just, it sends you into shutdown mode in a way that most movies do not. The one that always stands out, though, is the line that Elvira says about how it's in blood and death that gives an animal's life meaning. I feel like that's sort of the thesis for this film in a lot of ways. Just some trivia for this scene is Julianne Lorenz, who was maybe Fassbinder's second wife, and she was also maybe the editor on this film. She's made a lot of strange claims that may or may not be true. But in any case, she was a friend and late lover of Fassbinder's. But she says that, of course, Fassbinder himself was operating the camera for the slaughterhouse scene, but that he was wearing all white when he did it. He was wearing a white shirt and white pants. Too bad there's not behind the scenes photography for that. I'd kind of like to see what that was like. But Fassbinder was a big fan of, like he would always say that you should never pamper the audience, you should only challenge it, which is something that I very much agree with. I very much go to the school that like art shouldn't make you comfortable. Like that's not what movies are for. But yeah, of course, In a Year with 13 Moons does not make you comfortable. And then on the notion of Fassbinder being so good with the musicality of language, he's got a quote that I like a lot. He says, "It's much more important how language sounds than what the concrete content is." He wasn't specifically talking about the slaughterhouse scene when he said that, but again, I think that tells you his approach to language and how he uses it. The readings of the scene vary pretty widely, also by era. Like I feel like you get kind of different readings if you read contemporary reviews circa 78, 79, 80 versus what you read in new reviews now. But yeah, like a pretty common one is that Anton Seitz becomes a pimp, and that the slaughterhouse is how he treats his prostitutes, basically. It can also be that it's how Anton Seitz treats Elvira. It's how the world treats Elvira. It's how the world treats everyone. There's a lot of readings like that. The ones that were more contemporary to 78, 79, a lot of them dealt with the mutilation of the body, which I don't really think was Fassbinder's intention. Yeah, for all his problems, I don't think that was one of them. The music, which I didn't write down the piece, but the classical music that plays over the slaughterhouse scene, Fassbinder actually used in his first film too. His very first film, which he made when he was 20 or 21 years old, it's called The City Tramp. He uses that piece of music in that film. But The City Tramp, if you haven't seen it, is a short film where a man really, really tries to kill himself and just keeps on failing. So again, it's kind of a constant thread in Fassbinder's career. I think another reading of the slaughterhouse scene that's valid is that you can compare it to the finale of Eisenstein's Strike. Like you don't have the, I don't know, the like intellectual montage that Eisenstein championed, like the cross-cutting between two things, but I do think it's pretty easy to read it that way. So where I might really get myself into trouble is the discussion of In a Year with 13 Moons as a depiction of a trans character. the when I've talked about this film with friends, I have a lot of trouble with Elvira's pronouns. Because in the text of the film, it's not entirely clear. Like, she's definitely a trans woman, but you don't really understand how she sees herself, and it's hard to know how best and most accurately to refer to her. And you get, again, you get kind of different readings depending on what you read, and also you're beholden to translations because, like I said, I don't speak German. But Fassbinder in some writings referred to Elvira as a man up until the very end of her life. Like in Fassbinder's eyes, she was always a man, but that might just be a quirk of the translations I was reading. I've read other things where Fassbinder refers to Irvin like pre-op as he, him, and then Elvira post-op as she, her. But yeah, I don't think it's meant to be any depiction of what it means or what it's like to be a trans person. That never really seemed like it was Fassbinder's interest. You'll remember, like Fox and His Friends was about gay men, but the gay male community did not exactly embrace that film upon its initial release. And The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant was about the gay female community, but the gay female community did not really embrace Petra von Kant upon its immediate release. They weren't necessarily political films. Like Fassbinder was perfectly happy making like gay villains and just gay like assholes and things like that. And like he wasn't, I don't know, he wasn't exactly like proselytizing the gay lifestyle. Like his like LGBTQIA plus characters all were problematic people in the same way that everybody's a problematic person, and I admire him for that. But yeah, that's not always the case. Oh, I don't know. I think it's easy. Like I said, Fassbinder's sensibilities are much more in line with our sensibilities now than they were his at the time. Not his at the time, but like I don't know, like the community, like cultures at the time. And I think that there's a tendency to be like, well, you know, like this is a really early depiction of a trans character, and like maybe they're not perfect, but it's nice that they're depicted. I think that that's maybe being a little too generous. There were other trans characters. A decade before this, the Gore Vidal book, Myra Breckenridge, was a big hit. Again, that's not great. I don't recommend Myra Breckenridge. And yeah, the film wasn't a hit either. But still, like that was kind of a major pop culture trans character, or like Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, sort of. But like there was a lot of that. You had trans villains or confused trans characters. I'm not sure that Elvira is that confused, but again, it's thin ice I'm walking around on here. The one that I always like to compare it to, well, I've got the poster there of Let Me Die a Woman. Let Me Die a Woman came out the same year as In a Year with 13 Moons. They're both 1978. That's an exploitation doc by Doris Wishman that made a big fuss about it. But among other things, that has documentary footage of someone receiving a sex change operation. So you can imagine the crowd that went to see that film. But yeah, the comparison that I always like to make is to John Waters' film Desperate Living from 1977. Desperate Living was 1 year prior. But in that film, Mole McHenry, played by Susan Lowe, is like a lesbian, and she takes something wrong from her lover, Muffy St. Jacques, who's played by Liz Renee. But Mole McHenry misunderstands that Muffy wishes that Mole were a man, so Mole gets a sex change operation, and then comes to find out that it was all misunderstanding. So Mole cuts her dick off and throws it in the yard. But yeah, I feel like that's sort of a comedy variation on In a Year with 13 Moons. Almost to the John Waters was a big, loud fan of Fassbinder's. He very commonly would say in interviews how much he liked Fassbinder. Fassbinder comes up, I think, 3 different times in Shock Value, Waters' biography, his autobiography. And he writes a little bit about how much he likes Fassbinder in Crackpot, his first book of essays. But yeah, I feel like you could almost make the argument that In a Year with 13 Moons influenced Desperate Living, and that Desperate Living is just kind of like a comedic variation on a very tragic film, except that Desperate Living came first. It came out a year prior to like it was in theaters before Armin Meier even killed himself. It's just kind of a weird thing where they were aligned briefly there. But anyway, back to the notion of the depiction of a trans character in A Year with 13 Moons. Fassbinder wrote up an 18-page treatment of the film, and only the final 3 pages are the events of the film. The film, of course, takes place over just 5 days. So the first 15 pages of the 18-page treatment deals with Elvira's like upbringing and how she met and fell in love with Anton Seitz and stuff like that. There's a lot of dialogue in the film that you probably picked up where like there's discussion about how Irvin as a man wasn't gay. Like Elvira herself says that like she wasn't gay, that like she was even kind of homophobic when, like in the company of men. Like it in that scene after the really beautifully shot scene in the arcade where they go to Solfrida's house, and Solfrida makes some comment about how, well, deep down you were probably always a woman, like deep down inside, and Elvira says that she wasn't. Like it all came from a misunderstanding, that she really wanted Anton Seitz to love her, and Anton Seitz implied passingly that she would be okay if she were a woman, so she gets a sex change operation. Like there's not a deep implication that Elvira identifies as female. It's more, I don't know, opportunistic? That's not quite right. Something like that, though. One thing I've found myself considering is that the uniform is so important to German culture, like much more so than American culture, where like you really take pride in the uniform and you really show off the uniform and you really take a lot of like value and like symbolic meaning in the uniform. This is exemplified very much in like After We Were Now Is the Last Laugh, for example. But I wonder if the Elvira character sees being female as something of a uniform. I don't mean to posit that as like the truth or a correct reading. It's just something I've kind of kicked around in my head over the years. But then there's a lot of other things too, like the opening scene. Remember, Elvira dressed as a man. So it was someone who was born as a male, who had a sex change operation to become female, who is dressing as a man to pick up a boy. It's almost as if Fassbinder wants you to not really have a good read on Elvira's gender from the outset, from the very first scene. Yeah, I should probably stop there, and I hope that that came out okay. That was the one slide that I was the most worried about here. So I want to talk about some common like stylistic traits and filmic techniques and things of Fassbinder's. So when I taught this film the one time, it was in fall of 2016. I taught it in Survey of Film Theory and Criticism. I used it to illustrate a couple of essays, the David Bordwell essay, The Art Cinema as a Mode of Film Practice, which makes the argument that art cinema is motivated by two principles, both realism and authorial expressivity. It says that there's like a drifting episodic quality among like auteur-driven films, and that art cinema foregrounds the author as the structure of the film system, that you kind of go from the auteur's films, and it's more about like kind of recognizing authorial flourishes and like key collaborators and things more than it's like following the plot, like getting the story, like how most people watch movies and just want to be told a good story. And then I also used it as an example of Linda Williams's film bodies, gender, genre, and excess. The excess part is very clear here. Like this movie is excess. The rest of it, it's sort of a weird fit for that essay. And that's the one where she makes the argument that women in cinema embody, like in horror films, and embody fear, and in pornography they embody pleasure, and in melodramas they embody pain, and that you as an audience member does what the woman on the screen is doing. So in horror films you're screaming, and in melodramas you're crying, and in porn you can finish that sentence for me. But so I feel like In a Year with 13 Moons is definitely a melodrama, but kind of a weird one, where he's not trying to pull tears. Like, as depressing and sad as this film is, I don't think I've ever cried watching it, and I don't really think Fassbinder wants you to. He goes for something deeper, to where it like rattles your core, basically. But yeah, so I think it fits Linda Williams' notion of excess. It maybe doesn't fit the other arguments that she makes quite as clearly. So in Christian Brad Thompson's writing about Fassbinder, he writes a lot about doubling. We were talking about like the polarity in Fassbinder's personality, but he says that Fassbinder does a visual depiction of this based on like use of mirrors. So for example, if you watched Elvira, It's the Soul 2 weeks ago, it's bookended by a scene where first Emmy is in the mirror kind of examining like the woman that she's become, that, you know, like essentially picks up like a Moroccan immigrant and takes him back to her apartment and sleeps with them. And then at the end of the film, Ali looks in a mirror and kind of sees what he's become and tries to like slap himself out of it, basically. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of mirrors, there's a lot of mannequins, there's a lot of dolls in Fassbinder's films. But here, so what is it? I guess the second scene of In a Year with 13 Moons, Christoph, Elvira's actor lover, like forces her to look at herself in the mirror and see how ugly she's become, he says. But then right after Red Zora picks Elvira literally out of the gutter off the street and kind of takes her under her wing, they go to this bathroom that's depicted on the slide here, where there's just mirrors all around. So it's not just a doubling of the personality, it's a shattering of the personality. you get that too in the lighting, where like the scene where Christoph is like manhandling Elvira just before that. They have these expressionistic shadows where it's very splintered, where it's almost like a 50s era American film noir with like a lot of vertical lines. Like also Fassbinder likes having characters behind bars. It's kind of the shadow equivalent of that. But there's a lot of splintering and yeah, like refraction in this film. On the notion of like duality and mirroring too, the dance sequence scene where Elvira makes it to Anton Seitz and Seitz is watching the Martin and Lewis movie and they all do the dance along with them. That's kind of a weird, sad mirror that's more for Anton Seitz's sake, to where like he's trying to buy back the childhood that he lost in a concentration camp, but now he's rich, so he's trying to do the things he wanted to do when he was a kid. And Elvira just tags along. So like it's sad for both of them, really. But again, it's kind of that mirror. I said that Fassbinder's films tend to be autobiographical. There's a lot of elements there where when Fassbinder was a kid, his dad was a doctor in a red light district in Munich. But little boy Fassbinder apparently was very commonly, he would make friends with prostitutes. So it's nice that Elvira has a prostitute friend. It's like the one person on Elvira's side in this film. So it came up last week that Fassbinder at one point was married to Ingrid Coven. On Fassbinder and Ingrid Coven's wedding night, Fassbinder locked Coven out of the bedroom. She was crying in a nearby room while he fucked Gunther Kaufman in his bedroom on his wedding night, while his now wife was in the next room crying. So Ingrid Coven is the woman that plays Red Zora in this film. That's Fassbinder's, by this point, ex-wife. But of course, it's notable that in the end of the film, Red Zora fucks Anton Seitz while Elvira is killing herself in the next room. So it's this weird perversion of the reality where, yeah, Fassbinder really is Anton Seitz in this analogy. And then, of course, Gunther Kaufman is the one, he's kind of like keeping the camera from getting too close. He's the chauffeur, like he doesn't let you come into the room, basically. There's also kind of a thing too, well, where Elvira's marriage to when it was Irvin, his wife, it's depicted as being like important and loving, but sort of a wrong and a bad fit for both of them. That kind of applies to his marriage to Ingrid Coven. She has this great quote where she says that Fassbinder was a homosexual that needed women. It's that simple and that complex, something like that. That's a paraphrase. But I feel like that does kind of explain Elvira's character and her relationship to women. Although in the text of the film, Irvin / Elvira is not a gay man. Yeah, anyway, but yeah, there's a lot of the recurrent plot points in Fassbinder films. In Suicide, we've talked a lot about oppression, poisonous love. Also, like the oppressor enjoying and being like an active participant to oppression. He deals with like capitalist concerns a lot too. Of course, like Anton Seitz becomes a real estate speculator where Elvira is struggling to get by. Like by the end of this movie, it's basically Kurosawa's High and Low. And yeah, like that longing for death is the only possible liberation. So there's also kind of an interesting thing. If you watch a whole lot of Fassbinder films, which I have this month, and I don't entirely recommend, I love Fassbinder, but it's not great for your mental health to watch a bunch of Fassbinder films in a short amount of time. But you find that he kind of quotes, I should note, I realized it's 7:54. I'm almost done, I promise. But Fassbinder quotes himself from movie to movie. So like if you saw Fear Eats the Soul, the scene where Emmy goes and finds Ollie, where he's like with his mechanic buddies at the end, and one of his mechanic buddies is telling a bunch of jokes all in a row. All those jokes are told all in a row at the beginning of Why Does Her Run Amok? Like he tends to kind of quote dialogue from movie to movie and scenes from movie to movies, where he's sort of making like callbacks to himself almost. But you get that with In a Year with 13 Moons. The very first full-length play that Fassbinder wrote was Water Drops on Burning Rocks, which wasn't actually put on until after Fassbinder died. So it was the first full-length play that he wrote, but it wasn't performed until after he died. But then in the year 2000, the French director, Francois Ozon, made a film adaptation of Water Drops on Burning Rocks. But so Water Drops on Burning Rocks is kind of a variation on this story. And like I was saying about Desperate Living, it's basically a comedy, if you can imagine such a thing. But the main character is a 20-year-old, like tenuously straight male who's picked up by a 50-year-old gay man. But the 50-year-old gay man that picks him up is basically Anton Seitz. And then two other characters come in, including the 50-year-old man's like ex-wife / lover / something. But it turns out she has Elvira's story that on the 50-year-old man's suggestion. She got a sex change operation, and then he eventually dumped her. But yeah, I really like Water Drops and Burning Rocks. For the record, it seems like it's mostly forgotten at this point, but I totally recommend it. Also, there's an impromptu dance sequence in Water Drops and Burning Rocks, like there is in A Year with 13 Moons. So that leads me to where Fassbinder fits in, just kind of like in the larger world of cinema. I haven't seen it referenced this way. It seems sort of obvious to me that dance sequence is maybe sort of like a nice nod in the direction of Jean-Luc Godard's Band of Outsiders from 1964. Fassbinder was a noted fan of Jean-Luc Godard, and especially in his early career, he was seen as kind of like the torchbearer to where Godard was like, he was the person, I don't know, a lot of people say that he's the first modernist filmmaker. But then around 1968, after like Weekend and La Chinoise and La Guy Savoie, he went in the direction of Marxist filmmaking with Jean-Pierre Gorin. And he made like the Ziga Vertov group movies, like A Film Like Any Other and stuff like that. But he went down this rabbit hole where his movies were not really commercially viable anymore. I still like those movies for what it's worth. But right when Godard was doing that was when Fassbinder comes on the scene. So it's sort of seen like, here's Fassbinder who's doing sort of the same things that early Godard was, where, like Godard has gone like too far down the rabbit hole, to where Fassbinder can kind of pick up where Godard left off. He's sort of like an obvious heir. I mean, you do see references to Godard in a lot of Fassbinder's films, maybe notably Chinese Roulette, which he made a few films prior to In Air with 13 Moons. That stars Anna Karina, the girl in the dancing scene that I've got the pictures of there. But it co-stars Masha Merrill, who was the Anna Karina stand-in in Un Film Marié. He works with Eddie Constantine a lot. Let me caution himself. Eddie Constantine is he's in next week's film, The Third Generation. Yeah, and then I mean, like, it's come up in previous conversations that Fassbinder tends to be positioned between Douglas Sirk and Todd Haynes on a continuum of like the melodrama tradition. But I think he fits in just as well a lot of other places. The one that I wonder about is why he doesn't get grouped in with Andy Warhol more often, where Warhol again was a fan of Fassbinder's and Fassbinder was a fan of Warhol. Now, Fassbinder's final film, Corel, Warhol did the poster for it, which is what you're looking at. I really like that poster a lot. But yeah, I feel like especially early Fassbinder films, they might as well be Warhol films. I don't know if you've seen, when people think of Warhol as filmmaker, they tend to think of like Empire or Kiss or Couch or things like that, but it's more narrative films. Like a Vinyl, for example, is based off of A Clockwork Orange, and it was made before the Kubrick A Clockwork Orange. It's based off of the book before the Kubrick movie came out. But there's these kind of like flat, affectless readings of lines. And you get that from the early Fassbinder films. So like, I feel like if Andy Warhol were to make Jean-Luc Godard's Contempt, it would come out like Beware of a Holy Horror. And if Andy Warhol were to make Werner Herzog's Zaguerre, The Wrath of God, it would come out like Rio das Mortes. Like, I do think that they have a lot in common. In like this, the whole thing, like they both have like a factory, they both have communal living with like their collaborators. They're both prone to like, like whoever they think is sexually attractive, they put them either in front of or behind the camera, whether they're filmmakers or not. Like there's a lot of that type of commonality between them. And then I've already talked about affiliation with like John Waters. Incidentally, Fassbinder was childhood friends with Udo Kier, and Udo Kier is in a lot of Fassbinder's films, including next week's The Third Generation. Udo Kier, like, you know him, he's in everything. He was in Bacurau, I'm probably mispronouncing that horribly, last year. Or, he's in Dogville and whatever else. But yeah, he and Fassbinder went to gay bars as teenagers, which I think is amazing to imagine. Udo Kier, he's the best. But yeah, so Paul Morrissey, who kind of took over the Warhol filmmaking empire after Warhol himself was shot, he picked up Udo Kier. So Udo Kier's in Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula. It really just makes me regret that we'll never see a Fassbinder film that stars like 70s era Joe D'Alessandro or Holly Woodlawn or something like that. I feel like that would be amazing. But then like Fassbinder's contemporaries in New German cinema include like Werner Schroeder and Werner Herzog, who a lot of times are compared to the American avant-garde. Werner Schroeder especially, and the Werner Herzog of like Fata Morgana and stuff like that, you'll see in the context of the American avant-garde. You don't get that from Fassbinder so much, and I don't really know why. I feel like he fits in well. Like he's not doing exactly what Kenneth Anger was doing, but it's maybe a logical extension. And like if you see Volker Spengler in like Satan's Brew, he both looks and acts like he belongs in a Kuchar Brothers film. I don't know, like the Grindhouse filmmaker Andy Milligan is basically like a Grindhouse Fassbinder. Like their biographies are very similar, and like the types of films they made are very similar. Like I do think you can fit Fassbinder in a lot of places. In that way, biographically for me, my three favorite filmmakers are Jean-Luc Godard, Wong Kar-wai, and John Waters, and they feel so disparate. Like they don't really feel like those three directors have anything in common. The one thing that they have in common is Fassbinder. Like they're all three of them are fans of Fassbinder, and you can see, I don't know if Godard probably isn't actually, I'm talking out of turn there, but both Wong Kar-wai and John Waters are. Like Wong Kar-wai doesn't really seem like he would be a fan of Fassbinder, but he said so explicitly in the Big Book of Interviews. It's edited by John Powers. Wong Kar-wai said that he's influenced by Fassbinder. And then also two scores that Pierre Rabin wrote for Fassbinder films, Wong Kar-wai incorporated into first The Hand and then 2046. So they used Fassbinder music. And also the song that Jean Moreau wrote, or she didn't wrote, she performed for Carell, Each Man Kills the Thing He Loves, which is very apt here. That's an Oscar Wilde line. But Wong Kar-wai used that on the soundtrack for 2046 as well. John Waters called In a Year with 13 Moons Fassbinder's best film of all, for what that's worth, and he said that he was easily the most important film of his generation. And then there's other linkages too. I feel like I said, Fassbinder is the connective tissue in just about everything that I like. Even Bella Tarr, like I've been such a nerd for Bella Tarr in the past handful of years. Bella Tarr used Fassbinder's favorite female lead, Hanna Schigula. She's in Bergmeister Harmonies. And then I'm sort of fuzzy on this one, but Volker Spengler, Elvira from In a Year with 13 Moons, was attached to the Turin Horse. And he might actually even be in the Turin Horse, but I'm not clear on that. Maybe he's one of the gypsies or something. He's not in the credits. But if you read like trade announcements when Bella Tarr went into production on the Turin Horse circa like 2008, 2009, they all said that Volker Spengler was going to be in it. I'm just sort of unclear because there's only like 3 people in that movie and he's not any of them. So maybe he's a gypsy. I don't know. And the last thing I'll leave on before I open it up to a very late Q&A is if you get the old DVD of In a Year with 13 Moons, the American DVD, it was released in 2004 by Fantoma. There's an appreciation in the special features from Richard Linklater, who I feel like Richard Linklater is kind of an especially weird fit. Like it doesn't feel like Linklater's films were influenced by Fassbinder at all, right? But Linklater's a big fan of Fassbinder's. And he talks very specifically about how much he likes in the movie for love, In a Year with 13 Moons. So again, if you watch Linklater's films, you don't get it. I feel like you just don't see the Fassbinder influence. But so that disc of In a Year with 13 Moons with Richard Linklater talking about how much he liked it on it was released in 2004. In 2006, Richard Linklater released, I guess I should say, he finished Fast Food Nation. That's not one of the better known Linklater films, and I don't know if I should assume that anybody has seen it, but Fast Food Nation ends with a scene in a real slaughterhouse. I don't know, you do see Fassbinder's fingerprints in places that you wouldn't ever expect to find them. And yeah, like with Wong Kar-wai and with Richard Linklater, like you see it in Todd Haynes, you see it in John Waters, but like he's kind of everywhere in a way that I really appreciate. So I wanted to make sure you saw my sources. I read some books and whatever to prepare for this presentation, so I wanted to make sure you had access. But yeah, that's it. I'm sorry that I ran late, and I hope that there are interesting questions and that they aren't, hey, you said something horrible. So yeah, Jessica, if you want to come back and maybe feed me some questions.
All right, thank you for that, Pete. We are technically at 8:03, but I'm glad everybody's still here, so let's keep it going.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, so we have a few questions here. The first one is from Aidan Douglas. It says, the environments in this film are striking and run the gamut from incredibly loaded, slaughterhouse, Abbey Courtyard, to almost void-like, office complex, inky park paths. Seems to underscore the hopelessness of Elvira's plight when Fassbinder throws her up against so many tones and backdrops, as if to imply that her fate was decided and choices or influences could not change the inevitable outcome. So I guess that's the question. I guess just confirm that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's very eloquently put, much better than I would have or did put it. But yeah, I think Fassbinder is really good at that, to where he shoots in really beautiful cities, but doesn't show the beauty. And again, that's something you see in Wong Kar-wai, like the Wong Kar-wai of like Happy Together, like that doesn't make Buenos Aires look like a tourist attraction. And yeah, like Fassbinder's like Munich and Frankfurt and wherever else he shoots, like they don't look like a place that you'd want to go, but they're really beautiful. I haven't been, based on like what I've read and pictures I've seen, they're very beautiful cities. But yeah, he's good at kind of ferreting out the locations. I will say, specific to In a Year with 13 Moons, I do think a lot of it is weirdly pretty, especially that arcade. I think he shoots that arcade really, really gorgeously. But yeah, no, I agree with what you said. And like I said, I think you put it better than I would have.
Ooh, so Joshua Ray asked, I've always found it a miracle that this film is a very specific exorcism of Fassbinder's demons, but that you don't have to know the autobiographical facts to understand that from the film itself. I also can't really identify personally with a lot of the details of the film, but he manages to make, I think you called it, a cinematic howl of despair that is ultimately universally identifiable. What details do you think help the bad vibes?
Um, So I think I've made clear how much a fan I am of Fassbinder, but to your specific question, I think I give most of the credit to Volker Spengler. I think his performance as Elvira is just incredible. Um, I mean, Elvira in a lot of ways is a really pathetic creature. Like there's not a lot of footholds with her to where like she's so helpless and she makes, I don't know, she's so helpless and so unhappy in a way that hopefully none of us are, like none of us that are sitting on this webinar today are. But I don't know, like you really feel for her and you care about her. And I do think that most of that comes from Spengler's performance less than Fassbinder's script. And like I said, I think it says something too that Spengler improvised that last kind of extended monologue slash interview. Um, there was the contemporary review of this film from the Village Voice upon its US opening, which I think was in 1980. It was written by Andrew Saris. But Andrew Saris said something about how like it's a deeply exalting film and that he didn't think he could ever see the world in an entirely straight way ever again. And I do think that that film does kind of have that ability, in how exactly it's achieved. Even if, I mean, hopefully we haven't had anything like these experiences, right? Like hopefully this is very, very far away from like our day-to-day life. But it's such a personal film. Like it's almost like reading a diary. I don't know. Like Fassbinder tells you a story, but I think he uses like a fictional narrative in such, I don't know, like a bone deep way that you have to identify with it. Like I don't know. Again, I feel like I'm asking for trouble, but I don't recall ever showing this film to someone who wasn't deeply affected by it. And like the reaction doesn't tend to be like, oh, I couldn't relate, which hopefully you can't relate. The reaction tends to be like, oh, it was too much for me. Like it's such a hard film to watch. And I talked about that, I think, in the presentation, to where, you know, like a proper melodrama would, I don't know, you would try to get like the release of crying, like the release of tears, and like you would leave the theater feeling like you were a better person for having identified with the main character. I feel like in here with 13 Wounds, it wants to hurt you, like it's after something else. Yeah, I feel like it's Fassbinder working in the melodramatic mode, but kind of pivoting a little bit to different ends, and I think that that's what makes it have the effect that you're describing, Josh.
That too reminds me of what you said earlier about how out of all the times you've seen it, you've never cried despite the fact that it's so horrible. So it's like it's not even it's not provoking you to feel like a pity, but it almost feels deeper than that, I think is what,
Right. I
yeah.
just feel gross after I watch it. Like I said, it ruined my
Yeah.
night the other night when I watched it.
Ruined mine too. Kate Lore says, it's not a question, she says, but you're absolutely right that Fassbender would be canceled. But I think that when you look at his two self-proclaimed best films, Holy Horror, 13 Moons, it points to one important distinction between Fassbender and, say, Shia LaBeouf. Fassbender's work is always, always, always self-conscious, self-critical. Now he's often doing horrible things to people on set, making films about how he is a monster, how we're all monsters. But yeah, I guess I just think it's interesting the two that he thinks of as being as the most successful are in fact the most critical of Fassbinder himself. They're like exorcisms. Yeah.
That's very true. Of course, Kate, if those of you in the audience don't know, she's like the one real Fassbinder expert here. She was the one that did the presentation last week. But yeah, if she said that I was wrong, I would have to believe her. So I'm glad that she's at least mostly on my side here. Um, but yeah, that is something that doesn't. It's easy to notice that Fassbinder almost never portrays himself as a victim. Like he's an actor in most of his films, and he's almost always the villain. I'm like he's the villain. He's an asshole. He's cruel. I think only really Fox and His Friends is he anything like a victim really. Like usually he's the bad guy in one way or another.
So that's the end of the Q&A questions, but I did have some, well, I'll ask at least one,
Okay.
but So I'm wondering about the connection of the story to the concept of 13 moons in a single year. Like, what's the point of focusing on such a cosmic shift as like the reason for such an internal suffering? You know, is that something you can like speak to?
Kind of, and I'm glad you asked too, because I did a lot of research on it and I almost forgot to say anything. So it would have been just a lot of wasted time if you hadn't asked me. No, oh, there's something else just came up. Oh, it's from Francis. Anyway, we'll come back to you, Francis. I'm sorry. But yeah, to answer your question, I can't speak to, I don't know anything about like astronomy or like astrology for that matter. But the thing that he states about every 7th year is a moon year, and that some years there are 13 moons, and when those two things align, when you have a moon year that also has 13 moons, that's when you have personal tragedy. That all is true. 1978 was a moon year and it did have 13 moons. I don't know if that's some weird, I didn't get to the bottom of if that's a weird like Fassbinder superstition or if it pre-existed. But then in the intro to this film, like he talks about the previous years with 13 moons, like the where it was a moon year with 13 moons in the 20th century. And then the next one, so it cites 1978 as one. The next one after 1978 is 1992. I imagine there were people that were wondering if 2020 was one of those years. There was a lot of personal tragedy in 2020. There was a lot of cultural tragedy in 2020. 2020 was a moon year, but it did not have 13 moons, so it's not one of those. The next, after 1992, the next moon year with 13 moons is 2027. So hopefully 2027 is not horrible. But that's actually a pretty long gap between 1992 and 2027. That's a longer gap than there was for that happening in the 20th century. But yeah, I guess that's about all I have to say. I'm not sure how much that answers your question, but beyond that, I don't think I can say anything useful.
Yeah. Okay, so Francis says, my favorite scene is the one in the dark apartment with the mystic. I forgot their name. The individual.
Sulfrida.
Yeah, Sulfrida. The individual with the mustache who says, maybe you were always a woman deep down. There's a quote at the end of that scene that is written down on a sheet of paper and the camera rests on it for a moment. Was this a Fassbinder original or was this referencing something else? That quote deeply affected me more than anything else in the film, perhaps.
Oh, I don't remember too specifically. Geez. I want to say it's a Schopenhauer quote, but am I crazy? Yeah, I can't say with authority. I know what you're talking about, and I've read about it, but yeah, it didn't stick in my head. I'm sorry.
So Patty Lee says, thank you for introducing this movie. I'm glad I watched and got to know this director, a creature with talents, compassion, sorrow, and brutality, and many more. Nice film review by Pete and nice host by Jessica. Thank you. Thank you, Patty.
Thank you, Patty. Well, I ran way too long. I had a feeling I was going to do that. So I'm grateful everybody stuck around. So thank you all so much for sticking around. But I should wrap this up, I guess, or we should wrap it up before it gets too painful for everybody.
All right, yeah, so I guess we're at the end here. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around. We appreciate the questions and participation. We'll be doing this again next Thursday at 7 p.m. with Robert Hunt, and he'll be speaking on the third generation. So we hope to see you then.
Thank you.